I know many of you here tonight have walked through the doors of William J. Burke and Sons Funeral Home and are aware of the wonderful work they do for the community. When I moved to Saratoga almost 2 years ago and I met Carol for the first time and a rich history and the legacy of Burke, we both agreed that that was a story that needed to be shared more often. And I can see that you all agree because you're all here joining us tonight. I do hope most of you were able to view some of the artifacts on display on both sides. Before you took your seats, some of the archives, as Jamie mentioned, are from the museum's collection, and some are from the Burke archives. And thank you so much to Mark Phillips, who brought so many. I also, while working on this presentation with Carol and Mark, I shared some aspects of Victorian mourning customs, and we all agreed that we wanted to share them with you. Many of the customs have changed over the years, but at the same time, I think it's very important to sort of look back at that time period that Burke first started his business. So these first two slides, one is a cemetery image, and I chose this image to lead with because the photo on the back is marked 1893. And that was the year that Burke began his official business. Also, the piece next to it is an old ad or clothing illustration that would have been used for mourning clothes. In mourning, all black everything. And the other woman that is standing beside her is in what was known as half mourning. So you see the woman in tips of black, but with lavender and gray clothing. These images are known as weeper photos, and starting in the 1870s, staged photographs such as these of women crying increased in popularity. Although these images do not represent a spontaneous expression of grief, the sentiment and the meaning behind them was truly genuine. The use of weeping women in cemetery sculpture, memorial, and photography was especially popular in the Victorian era. So I wanted to talk a little bit about postmortem photography. This is one of my areas of expertise. And when we think back to this time period, so Louis Daguerre's introduction of the photographic process and the daguerreotype in 1839 must have seemed like it was miraculous to the early Victorians. So I always refer to these images and photography in general as a memory keeper. Here, three sisters are seen together, one is deceased. It's not uncommon for family members to pose with deceased loved ones, and before funerary science and funeral homes, many funerals were carried out in the home and bodies were handled by family members. This is another beautiful postmortem image, and this is from the museum's collection. It's a hand-tinted photograph of a girl in a casket. It's a more elaborate postmortem, and this one is from the early 1900s. It's a really beautiful horse-drawn hearse and carriage, and this is circa 1895, and I've done a lot of research on horse-drawn hearses and carriages of the time, and this is from the Burke Archive. It can be attributed to the Riddle Hearse and Coach Company, which was a company based in Ravenna, Ohio. And note the elaborate nature of the carriage with a beautiful black crepe draping and also the really beautiful black urns tipping the top. It would have been indicative of a very prominent or wealthy person's hearse of the time. And I know Carol is very interested in engaging the audience tonight. Carol has some Ben & Jerry's coupons here for us to hand out. So she wanted me to kind of throw some Q&A in to get some people involved. So this next image relates to this carriage. And does anyone know where this is located? Gloria, you cannot answer this, but I'll let you. Yes. So Gloria May, for those of you who don't know, is an amazing wealth of knowledge on the history of Greenridge Cemetery. She's amazing. So yes, this is the Sackett Gates off Lincoln Avenue at Greenridge Cemetery here in Saratoga. I took this image in the fall, and I chose this image in conjunction with the horse-drawn carriage hearse because I wanted to note that at these gates there is both a carriage and a walking entrance something we don't normally think about these days. We think of it as a driving entrance, but it originally would have been for horse-drawn carriages. So this is a casket plate or a coffin plate. It's been one of my favorites. For those of you who are able to view some of the artifacts we have on view, we do have a casket coffin plate that's an engraved piece that's J.M. Putnam. It's from the Putnam family in Saratoga, and that piece is in the museum's collection. But I wanted to talk a little bit about this piece because I feel it really is just so, not only sad, but just really an exquisite example of something from this period, representing the sad hour. So essentially, the hands of the clock would be turned to the time of a person's death. This is another one of the framed items on display. This is the U.S. Grant black bordered cards. And I wanted to talk a little bit about black bordered stationery, which was commonly used at the time during the mourning period. And then also earlier this week, Mark brought in some really beautiful examples from the Burke archives that are also in here in one of the cases, along with the hair jewelry. So if you get a chance after, please definitely take a look at those. And this piece is also in the museum's collection, and it's also on view here this evening. It's a traditional Victorian hair wreath. And this hair wreath is usually displayed on the second floor of the museum, so if you don't get a chance to see it today, you could always pop in to take a closer look. It's really beautiful and intricate. In saving and weaving hair for wreaths, mourning jewelry and other mourning items was a common Victorian practice. These intricate memorial tributes were usually created entirely from hair of deceased family members, and clipped strands were usually woven, and they were entirely shaped by hand. So these two images really bummed Jamie out this morning when we were going through the presentation. So these two images represent pet memorial photographs, and I thought it was something important to add. So one of the photos is of 3 pugs, and the other is of 2 children with their deceased pet dog. It's interesting to note that the Victorians didn't only mourn their human family members, they mourned their pet companions as well. I know that one of the rings I commonly wear holds the ashes of one of our pet cats. So I've had memorial jewelry that the tradition still holds today. You can see one of the children embracing their deceased pet, and then with the pugs, typically this would be reserved for a show dog or a very prominent, wealthy family's pet. So you see the pug at the center is deceased, wearing a crepe mourning ribbon. And, I chose these images kind of in particular to segue over to Carol's portion, because while we were preparing for this lecture, Carol shared this really touching story with me about a woman who approached her father, and she wanted to have a memorial or a wake for her family pet. And so I wanted to now hand the mic over to Carol, or she already has a separate mic. But I also wanted to thank you so much for listening and for being here this evening and supporting the museum. It really means a lot to us. So thank you so much.
So I know a lot of you have lost pets, and it's really a traumatic experience. But my father started working for Burke's. He was young, fresh out of the service, and in 1947. And early on in his career, in the early 50s, he shared this story that stuck with him. And a lady approached him, and she had 7 dogs. One of her dogs died. The first one died, and she was heartbroken. And she wanted to have a funeral, and she asked him if he would embalm her dog. And at the time, he wasn't able to do that, and she wanted to have a full funeral for him. So what my father did arrange was, at that time, Burke's didn't have a garage where that could happen, but Clark and Tunison's did. So he arranged to get a child's casket for the dog, and she had a full-on wake in the garage and brought the other 6 dogs all dressed in black bows. And they sat there, and it was just an experience that stuck with him. And it was a little strange, but having lost a golden retriever that was like a human to me, I understand that now. So that's my pet story. So I often was asked, oh, was your last name Burke? And no, it's Stone. And what's it like to grow up in a funeral home? I didn't grow up in the funeral home. The Burke families lived in the funeral home. My father was their sole employee, and my parents moved there in 1984, so I did have experience there. But we had the phone in our house. So in the early days of the funeral home, there were not answering services. So we always had the Burke's phone. And very early on in my life, I was taught how to respect that phone. And if no one else was home by the time I was a teenager, I learned what you were to say. Because if you lose someone, you don't want to get an answering service. You don't want to have no answer. So that was probably something that was just drilled into us from very early on. So it definitely shaped my life. So what was it like to grow up in that business? And I'm going to get my sidekick up here, Mark, because he's going to have stories too. Mark started very young. He was 16 when he started working in the business. So it did shape my life. First of all, anybody who had a parent who owned a family-owned business, vacations. 1 week a year, we got to go to Maine. It was just far enough away, my dad couldn't get called back unless somebody really important died. So family vacations were not very frequent. Also dinner. So wakes were 2 to 4 and 7 to 9. Dinner was between that, on the early side. We always had a black car, so I've never wanted to have a black car after that. And just, my sisters and I were talking about this. Hopefully we learned a compassion, because death eventually hits all of us, and we watched it, and we watched our dad and how he handled that. So one of my questions is, how many of you have never been to Burke's? I like to know my audience. Okay.
Names, please.
So hopefully at the end of this, our goal is that you're going to learn a little bit about this funeral home and why we think it's important for you to know, because we think it kind of tells the story of the United States. And you're going to see 3 distinct examples in my part of the talk, and Mark probably has lots more. So why does somebody go into this business? And I often ask my dad that. Usually it was handed down from family member to family member, but that wasn't the case with my dad. So my dad wanted to be a doctor, but he didn't have the money to do so, to go to medical school. And for him, this was as close to being a doctor as he could get. You needed to take a lot of anatomy courses. You needed to know a lot about the human body. So if we were ever hurt or sick, my sisters and I never went to our mom. We always went to our dad, and he knew what to do. So that's why he went into it. But typically, when this started, and the man who started it all, his picture's up here, William Joseph Burke Sr., you started as a cabinet maker or a woodworker, and that's how he started. He was a cabinet maker, a woodworker, and he took an apprenticeship. He went down to New York City and he studied with a coffin manufacturer. He perfected that craft and came up here. And he got his apprenticeship with a man named Ebenezer Holmes. How many of you have heard that name before? Okay, where have you heard that from? How do you know of him?
My name is Holmes.
Are you related to him?
Possibly.
Possibly, okay.
Jokes about him in my
I will temper my remarks then. Okay. So Ebenezer Holmes was an undertaker. So Mark, this is where I need you up here. So this was a nails on the chalkboard thing for my dad. He was a funeral director, not an undertaker. So Mark, come on up, and he's going to tell us the distinction between the two.
I thought you were going to say something about the Holmes family, and I have nothing to say negative about the Holmes family.
Oh, neither do I.
Interesting question is the profession of funeral directing, undertaking, and embalmers is under now the health department, and of course there's cemetery divisions, but back in the, let's say, late 1700s, after the country was still very new, undertakers just evolved because they were the country western storefront, and there was the shootout at the OK Corral, and they needed someone to take care of, obviously, what happened. So an undertaker was the cabinet and furniture maker. It evolved into second-hand business, is that you didn't have an inventory. You would make the coffin to meet the individual's needs and size. So you were just the undertaker, undertook this task to do what needed to be done. And you know, it evolved into the science. The Civil War came along, the embalming practices, the preservation. Then licensure was involved, back to Carol's mention about her father's interest in anatomy and doctor. The science of embalming was the temporary preservation. The Egyptians had it right, whatever, thousands of years ago, but undertaking evolved into the embalmer. That was a specialized science and knowledge of what had to be done correctly with the preservation. Eventually, at the turn of probably 1890s, the state stepped in and there was a licensing board that you had to make sure you met certain qualifications. It was states' rights, so it wasn't universal in the United States, but an embalmer could be specific to embalming, an undertaker could do some chores, and cabinet making was into the furniture homes and houses now. So the funeral director evolved from those two businesses. So it became licensed in 1894 that you could officially be a licensed funeral director if you already met the qualifications of being an undertaker and an embalmer. So some states in this union still, you do not have to be a licensed funeral director. So you can do your profession, house painting, school teaching, whatever, and there's maybe 3 states that don't have it. But sadly, over the years, the pandemics and things that require the knowledge and the, quote, expertise had to be specified and legislated, and of course, here we are today. Is that it in a nutshell?
I think that's it. Okay, so Dan is not an undertaker. He's a funeral director. And neither is Mark. Yeah. So Mr. Holmes comes back to Saratoga and he takes his apprenticeship, or excuse me, Mr. Burke, with the Holmeses. And at that time, what's happening in around 1880s, just outside of Saratoga? Anybody have an idea? Okay, Carol Waldron knows this one. Okay, General Grant is here. He has finished his presidency. He's rather ill. He's also rather poor, and he's afraid his family isn't going to have enough money to live after his death. So he comes here to write his memoir. It's actually where he stayed is called Drexel Cottage. So after the apprenticeship that Mr. Burke had, Mr. Holmes was kind of brilliant in the fact embalming was not common. So anyone at this time that dies in Saratoga is not embalmed. So what Mr. Holmes developed, and we have it, if you haven't seen it up here, this is not his original one, but it's a copy of it. He developed an ice casket. So basically, it's like a giant Yeti cooler. So if you die, you were laid out in the ice casket, you were preserved until your family waked, and everybody's waked in the home. He brings the ice casket in, you're prepared, you're laid out, and then you're buried out of the ice casket. So Mr. Holmes had the patent on this, which was pretty brilliant. So here is a picture of his patent. And so when General Grant dies, at this point, for whatever reason, Mr. Burke decided he doesn't want to be in the funeral business. So he's gone back to his carpentry skills, and he's doing carpentry up at Mount McGregor. When Grant dies, he happened to be there that day. The manager of the Drexel Cottage called into town knowing that Mr. Holmes had this casket and said, "Come on up." There's only, at this time, 10 knowledgeable embalmers in the entire country. It's a new craft. So a man named Stephen Merritt lived in New York City. Mrs. Grant wanted him to come. And this was a request from General Grant. President Lincoln had been embalmed, and that preserved his body. And at that time, for about 2 weeks, everyone in the country would come and view the president. So he wanted that same thing. So it took a little while for Mr. Merritt to get up here from New York City. I'm sure Mr. Holmes was nervous. I know I would be nervous. So he started drinking that afternoon. I think he drank a lot, according to the New York Times. So he was drinking. Mr. Burke witnessed and helped out the best he could. The chemicals, it was a gentle, delicate balance. It didn't work out so well. By the time Mr. Merritt got there, he felt he needed to re-embalm General Grant, so he did. No one really knows what happened, but the end result was, I know several people in the audience know what happened to Grant. Yes, Susan?
It didn't work out well. It was black and it was very undercut.
Yes, he was discolored and his skin was black, so he was not able to be shown. So the New York Times wrote an article about this, and as you can see, and on top of that too, Mr. Holmes presented a bill for $500 for his 4 hours of service. At that time, that was about $15,000. So the family paid Mr. Merritt for his services, but they were not going to pay Mr. Holmes. So the New York Times got a hold of this, and they wrote an article. And here you see a little excerpt of the article. And Mr. Holmes didn't like this because they accused him of being drunk. They said he wasn't fit to do this job. He felt it ruined his business. So there was a lawsuit, and he sued the New York Times for $25,000 for libel. In the end, after the trial, he was awarded $5,000. He never went back to the business of being a funeral director or undertaker. But this also is in the bolster collection. These are the implements that were used in the embalming of General Grant. So where is Mr. Burke in all this? So he's witnessed this historic event. Obviously, he's been called to testify in this trial that went on twice. And for whatever reason, he decided, well, he was asked by Mr. Holmes' son to come in. One of the employees is going on vacation. Will you cover for just a week? Well, that employee never came back. So there he is. So he decided, you know what, I'm going to step away from the Holmes and I'm going to open my own business. And he did. And these pictures, how many of you have seen these floating around on Facebook? I see it often. They're often reposted. One is at Christmas time. And this is at 457 Broadway, not where Burke's was on Broadway. This is their initial one. And this is just, I love the reflection. Mark and I were talking about this. You can see the buildings across the street. At Christmas time, that it was decorated that way. But I also love this carriage list. And as you look at this, notice it says open day and night. Well, how did they do that? Well, at the time, many people didn't have phones. So they had a night watchman. And if someone died, the night watchman was alerted, and then he got a hold of the Burkes. And this was basically my life, the DeSalle's life, Mark's life. I'm sure you have lots of stories about getting up in the middle of the night. My parents' bedroom was just down from mine, and I can remember that phone ringing and my dad having to get up, because at that time, most people died at home, and the family called, and my dad would have to go and remove them. So, open day and night still is the case, but that is my favorite part of that. So, what else was happening in the greater context of Saratoga? Well, in my whole life, most of my life growing up, there were 4 funeral homes in town. And generally, their clients were associated with either, if they were in clubs with them, but mostly if they went to the same church. So the Burkes were Irish Catholics. So most Irish Catholics went to the Burkes. This other funeral home that's still operating today, Tunison's on the corner of 105 Lake Avenue. This started as a funeral home in 1926, and this was operated, the Tunison's, Mr. Tunison was Baptist, so if you were Baptist, generally you went there, or another form of Protestant. What I love about this photo is this building was designed by my favorite Saratoga architect, Newton Brzee. He did about 50 buildings in Saratoga, all Victorians. And this was designed as a single-family home, but it lent itself to being a funeral home with the wraparound porch, the porte-cochere, the lovely lawn, the garage. And ironically, 628 North Broadway was also designed by that same architect as a single-family home. The other funeral homes in town, Bussing and Caniff, was on 130 Circular, and now it's a temple, yes, a temple. And they folded into Burke's in 2001.
Correct. Yep.
Mark, you want to add anything on that? He's supposed to be standing next to me. He's sitting down.
I'm short enough you wouldn't have known if I was standing or sitting anyways, but it was a decision of the operators at that time they fulfilled their mission, their children grew up. They chose to move away from New York State, and we had a great rapport with all funeral directors here. This is no commercial for Burke, but everybody, we would help one another, you'd loan cars. It was a working operation among our peers. So these folks, wonderful, they still have relatives in Saratoga Springs, approached us and just said, would you like to consider taking over our firm? And that would have meant, okay, you're going to niece's wedding in Pennsylvania for 3 days, sure, I'll see you when you come back Monday. And no, I want you to consider taking over our firm in full. And it was just meant to be. It certainly strengthened our profession, it consolidated facilities, it also was a boost to the way the operation of a funeral home can be. We're not just limited to serving Irish, Italian, Catholic, etc. And that was where the barriers came down. It's a free world, you can call anybody you'd like to have, they're all professional, but I always thought that was a wonderful thing that happened because it allowed everybody, whether you were next door neighbor, you couldn't go to a funeral home just because you were of a different religion or a different nationality. No, everybody does everything, and we're pretty much on the same page today.
And the other funeral home was a beautiful building, Simone's Funeral Home on 3 Franklin Square. And the Simones were Italian Catholics, so Italian Catholics tended to go there along with Jewish people because they were equipped to handle.
Right, the procedures and certainly the sanctity of Shever Kaddish, Tara, etc. But it was just nice to have everybody have their niche. And at that time, everybody says Saratoga hasn't changed much in the population. The population is somewhat the same, but the amount of people that have been healthy here, every funeral home used to do about 85 to 95 calls a year. You know, we serve 4 times that number nowadays because there are just two funeral homes in Saratoga Springs. But it's a wonderful point of knowing that you have the freedom to choose and go where you wish.
So in 1945, the Burke Funeral Home had been on Broadway, but they bought this building as trends changed and people didn't wake in the home as much anymore. And they bought this property. It was built for Theodore Hamilton, who was a prominent lawyer. And again, the wraparound porch designed by Newton Brzee. And this was Jim Burke and his wife Sally, and they lived at that funeral home. They never had any children, and Jim probably ate dinner at our house or went out to dinner with us every Saturday of my life for at least 20 years. He was a lovely man, and he really carried on. People say to me, did you ever watch 6 Feet Under? And I tried to, and I watched it again this last week, the first episode. And my problem, although they hit a lot of key things that happen in the business, and they nailed that, is I felt the family was dysfunctional. The Burkes were the epitome of class, of manners, of grace, of respect for the community, respect for others. And I learned a lot from Mr. Burke. The other thing I love about this slide is this ad, and it says invalid coach service. So when I rewatched this episode, there's a scene where the mom is driving back and her daughter's driving the old hearse, and she said, funeral homes once provided ambulance service, and that was true here. I can remember the phone ringing in the middle of the night. And from 1915 to 1968, Burke's provided ambulance service. And the reason was that the funeral hearse was long enough to carry a stretcher. And so the mom says that, she said, your dad used to joke if he just drove around the block 4 times or 5 times, he could have cut a step out sometimes. And we never felt that way. But we stopped doing that service because it was a difficult thing. And also in 1967 in Saratoga, the Volunteer Ambulance Corps was formed. So they kind of took over those services. And then in 1968, Congress passed a law, the Highway Safety Act, and they said, you can't transport bodies without proper equipment like oxygen. So Simone's Funeral Home, when I was looking through city directories, and maybe somebody here knows when they stopped doing this, but in 1973, they were still providing ambulance service because they had oxygen. So that was still an option. So I don't know if I got sick and needed to go to the hospital, if I'd want a hearse coming up to get me, but that did happen. Did anyone ever know anyone that used that service? Oh, so Corinne, yeah? Corinne did hair for us. So here's a side. So Corinne Scirocco is on the board of the History Museum, but she was our hairdresser for 51 years. And I tried to get some stories out of her, and she was very tight-lipped. But Corinne, you knew people used the ambulance service?
For St. Patrick's Day. Parents are getting ready to go. My knee went out of joint. Your knee went out of joint?
My knee went out of joint, yes. There I laid on the floor. Called somebody, I don't know who they called, but up came Simone's, all in their tuxedos, their little green carnations, and away I went to the hospital, yeah.
In a hearse.
And I was about 11 then, so.
11 in a hearse. Oh, you're brave. So that stopped, and now, of course, we call 911, but the thought of calling a hearse is mind-boggling. So here's 465. So we know that they started at 457. In 1906, Mr. Burke Sr. bought this building. And when I had done this story, Mitch, my neighbor, helped me with this story. We did some research on it. And this had been a doctor's office, and he went bankrupt, and the family had to put it up for auction. And Mr. Burke bought it in 1906. Today, we know this as the Adirondack Trust Company. If you go get your mortgage, you're really where the Burkes, so this is Bill Burke, and he and his wife T lived upstairs, and downstairs was the office. So what did you do with the office? Well, that's where you went and paid your bill, that's where you made your arrangements, that's where you went to the showroom. So I have a picture of the showroom in the next slide. So here was our showroom where the caskets were lined up. In the back, and this building doesn't exist anymore, was a garage where the prep room was. This is where the embalming took place. And when the Adirondack Trust Company took over this building and they purchased it, they took down that structure, and now that's where you park if you go in the back to get your mortgage. So what happened? Well, one day Hollywood came to the prep room at 465. Many of you probably remember the movie Ghost Story was filmed here in 1980, and they contacted the funeral home and they wanted to do a scene in the embalming room. And they even had the floor redone, and here's Melvin Douglas laid out in the scene. And my father was really excited. Mark, did you go to watch that?
My wife Michelle and I, we were fortunate. They filmed everything at nighttime, but it was illuminated as if it was 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I think it was someone recovered from a drowning, And it was unbelievable that it was involved. I think it was Universal Studios.
It was, yes. Yeah. So it made the cutting room floor, but I think you got a new floor out of it. I think
There was always a benefit having Hollywood take care of things. It was good.
So that was a little bit of a disappointment. Something else that kind of signified history that happened when they were at this location, and I'm sure there's times that you have where you couldn't keep your composure, and people say, well, you do this every day, you must get used to it. Well, there's times you just don't get used to it. And I remember 2 times in my dad's life where he could not keep his composure, and this was the first time. So my dad ran the youth group at Bethesda Episcopal Church, and one of his youth group members was Denton Crocker. His nickname was Mogi. And here's a picture of him. Denton he was a senior, he graduated early, he really had a deep desire to serve our country and go to the Vietnam War. His parents did not have that same desire, but he won them over. And before he left, they took his picture in uniform with his siblings. Many of you know Candy and Randy Crocker. Randy had a restaurant in town for many years. And they took this picture. He lived on White Street. Well, after Mogi was there for a year, he died one day after his 19th birthday in service. And his mother was very distraught, and she wrote a book about it called Son of the Cold War, and it's in the Library of Congress. When Ken Burns was researching the Vietnam series, he went to the Library of Congress and he read her book, and he was so moved. He said, I'm getting in the car and I'm driving to Saratoga Springs to talk to this woman. And Jean Marie Crocker, we buried her in 2020. Yes. She was a remarkable woman. My sister was really close friends with Candy's, and my parents were good friends with her. And in this series, they decided to take his story and weave it through the 10 parts. So this is the title slide that you will see if you watch that series, and it kicks off every segment. And in episode 3, this was a surprise. I know Mark texted me that night when you were watching it, to all of us. Mrs. Crocker was being interviewed, and she said, well, I called Dick Stone's funeral home. Well, it's really Burke's, but that's who she knew, and so she called my dad. And so an Army captain escorted her through the whole process. My dad walked Mogi down the aisle of Bethesda Church and sobbed. And I did not go, but my older sister did, and she told me about it, and it brings chills to me. And then he escorted the body to Arlington Cemetery, and it was a profound part of his career, and it left a mark on him. He had never been there, and it was very moving. And Mark and Michelle visited it, so these are their slides from his grave there. Do you have anything to add to that?
No, it's what you mentioned. This isn't a profession that, it's joyful every day. So many people that are here tonight says that this is an important part of our lives, and, there's a time to celebrate, but you don't forget any of the families, and I think that's humbling, too, to know that your father certainly served as best he could, but it was the severity of it.
And I think it was the first death in our area of the Vietnam War, and I think it just kind of reflected what was happening all over the country at the time. So again, history here at Burke Funeral Home reflected what was happening in the rest of the world and the rest of our country. So my father's was taken in as full partner when Jim, it was 2 brothers who ran the funeral home. When Bill died, Jim took him in as a full partner. And in 1983, they decided to move the operations all up to North Broadway. So they left 465 and moved up to North Broadway. And here they are in North Broadway. And Tom Armour was also an employee. So the way it worked is that after my dad was taken as a partner, he felt that that was quite a gift. And my dad he had 3 girls, he didn't have any sons, and he had met Mark, and he'll tell this in his part. He met Mark when Mark was 16, mowing lawns at St. Peter's Cemetery. And he was taken with Mark, and Mark started working at the funeral home and kind of became the son he never had. And so after Mark had worked there all those years, my dad decided that he and Tom Armour would get the business so they could keep the legacy of the Burkes going and keep that name going. Jamie Turcock is the other person there. She was from Greenwich and Schuylerville, and her family had a funeral home there. So she worked at our funeral home and was one of the first females in the profession. In 1990, my dad did extensive renovations and made it handicapped accessible. And you see the ramp there. Unfortunately, that was the year he died. So he died at 64. He never really got to enjoy all these renovations. But the one thing that happened in 6 Feet Under that kind of really grabbed me, if you watched the first episode, Michael C. Hall's father dies, and he's at the cemetery, and he's walking away, and a man approaches him, and he said, "We want to buy your funeral home." Well, that's exactly what happened to my mother. So my dad died, and probably 2 days later, if you've ever heard of this company called SCI, Service Corporation International, they came to my mom and they said, "We'd like to buy your funeral home." And what they are basically is the Walmart of funeral homes. They go in, they pick what they think is one of the more successful funeral homes, they buy it up, they drop the prices, they then bankrupt the competition, and then they have a monopoly, and then they can do whatever they want with the prices. So my mom said no. And 2 weeks later, I happened to be in her living room, and they came back. And the man who came put a blank check in front of her, and he said, "Fill out the amount." And she just said, "Well, there would not be an amount that you could put there that would ever make me do that." So again, that reflected what happened in our funeral home across the country, so much so that 6 Feet Under featured that. So after my dad died in 1990, my mom continued to live at the funeral home till 2003 and was the president, but yet basically all she did was answer the phone, and Mark and Tom did all the work. And I love this picture of Mark that Ed Burke took for an article when he was writing about trends in funeral homes. So at this point, I'm going to kind of turn over. Mark's going to just share some remarks from that point going to today.
Can you just take that off?
Mark said I have to take this picture off.
Okay. Sorry about that. You know, again, the knowledge that these two ladies have, it's very interesting, and it's wonderful to have been a part of it. I continue to refer to this as a profession. I was in the right place at the right time. Whatever Carol's mother and father saw in myself or Tom is certainly what is reflected in the DeSalle family. That certainly is the mainstay. And I'm really only the third of a generation from Mr. Burke, that I was given an opportunity. Enough about me, but it was just a great association of knowing people had trust in someone else, which we do now, and I'm thankful. There's many family. I look out here, it must have been a slow TV night if there's this kind of turnout, but I know there'll be questions. I just have a few notes. I'm not as polished as these two articulate ladies are. I'm grateful every day for the opportunity to have been a funeral director. It sounds odd, but your curiosity of hearing what's here is certainly a big reason of it. I repeat about serving families. We're family to many people, and I don't take that for granted. And yet, many people in this room have supported my wife and myself when we've had loss. So we don't move away, we don't get away from it. It is a heart-wrenching business. When I walked in, I was hoping somebody was going to turn the lights up here. It's a little too dark for me, but it's a just satisfying knowing that at least you can try to help someone, whether it was a cat or a dog that passed away, the importance of a life that's well lived, and that's not a cliche. We celebrate life every day, and we should continue to do so, whether it's our 106-year-old grandmother or it's our 3-year-old pet. There was always a great association in this community. We're fortunate to have established businesses. There's florists, markets, restaurants, everything that has the roots of Saratoga. You know, are we getting away from that? That's for another time. But the privilege of I mean, I'm looking at everybody and I can think of a story of what may have happened. And that was my education in my life. If Burke is, ironically, did you know that this is 130th year and how you picked this program to be tonight? I've been able to be going on 54 years of being associated with this as my sole job, and I wouldn't trade it in for a second. It's humbling, but it doesn't matter how many notes I have here. I think we're going to have some questions and answers. Is that right, Jamie? When do you turn the lights off, by the way?
One thing Mark is going to tell us about is
yes,
that the continuing challenges. So fortunately in my dad's lifetime, his biggest challenge was when AIDS epidemic came into play. And Mark's going to tell us some stories about that. And
It takes
then
a school teacher to get me back on my, my notes here, so yes.
And then probably more recently, an even bigger challenge that no one could ever imagine was the COVID challenge.
You know, everybody is a survivor and you have a will to live, but back in the 1917, 1918, the influenza that hit worldwide and certainly this country, I looked it up to get a stat, over 21 million people died from that flu. The Burkes, and I'm certain their peers that were in business at that time, they didn't back away from it. They didn't pack up and go to better climates. They didn't shy away from it. It's like our heroes, the fire, the first responders, the paramedics, police, etc. And the Burkes never got sick. They handled everything with the staff they had. As Carol mentioned before, people were laid out, passed away at their home, would have been laid out at their home. And this was done on a 2 or 3 day basis. And then you went to the next house. I think it was the month of October in 1918, 61 people died in our records. So other funeral homes had the same volume. They survived. Back to the sad early stages of AIDS and HIV pandemic, funeral homes were refusing to help when a death occurred. So little knowledge was aware in the profession, but Carol's father did not shy away. I remember, I think it was 1981 or 82. Not brag, I'm a blood donor, and I thought when I was asked to do what my boss said, I thought that was going to be critical for me not being a blood donor. How naive I was. And Dick, this is an inmate that passed away upstate somewhere. 8 or 9 or 10 funeral homes refused to, said, we can't handle it. But your father stepped forward. And that was a big lesson for me to know when the chips are down, it's a way of life. You have to take care of it. And then, of course, as we've just gone through the last 4 years, staff, where's Nick? Nick and your father and Stephanie, the whole staff, we've hired additional people. We've had apprentices, young ladies. We have 2 funeral director females that are just phenomenal. One has moved south now, but they went to work every day. Again, no commercial. Everybody in the health field, home care, nursing, pharmacies, supermarkets. But when this health epidemic could have been worse, hard to imagine. I'm so proud of the people that do what they do and don't walk away or say, sorry, I can't help you. It's good to help our fellow man, and that is one lesson I've been grateful to hopefully reflect a little bit of what your dad taught me. So, how much time we got? I don't know what's going on here.
We got
I am getting that. Where's the hook?
Oh.
Thank you.
You're going to tell us about this photograph, too.
Sadly, exactly. You know, today cameras and video, et cetera, every funeral home has had someone that wants to come in and take a picture. This was back in, I believe, 1947, and this is at Green Ridge Cemetery. A family wanted, it's the only time they got together, they had a wake, they had a funeral, and Carol Waldron, God bless her, we're the ones we turn to all the time at Greenridge Cemetery. They wanted a photograph taking of their entire family. We'll probably never get together again. That's, I don't have to share the name of who it was, but the solemnity. We know all black and white pictures, nobody ever smiles, but today they'll stand next to the casket, or they'll show the piece of flowers they had. They'll bring the tray of food that they wanted to share, and everybody's smiling. So there's a difference in 70 years right there, and it's heartfelt. That's some memento of the family that was still important to them. Is that enough?
That's great.
Here's a good
So
picture.
today, yes, we have with us the DeSelles, who now, what was the official date of when you bought it, the funeral home?
Oh, it seems like it was just yesterday. Probably in 2021.
July of 2021, the DeSelle family from Mechanicville decided that and Dan had been an employee when my mom was still alive, wanted to take over the business and keep the Burke's legacy going. And they have done an amazing job, especially during the challenge of
And
COVID.
it's very proud to turn that over to it. We're still affiliated with the staffing and working, but the nice thing is the continuity. They come from funeral director family, and they serve Saratogians that have come to know them since 2001, the year we acquired busing, is the year that Dan came with us. So life goes on.
So we're going to turn over, we'll have a couple of minutes for some questions, and Charlie Kensel gave me this idea earlier today, because I said, Charlie, I'm a little bit nervous about doing this because it's so close to home. I'm not sure if I can do this with the same grace that I've done other presentations with. And he said, I said, do you ever forget what you're going to say? And he said, no, I don't. He said, when I do, he said, I go to class and I say, try to stump me. So for this question and answer, you may stump me. You will get a Ben & Jerry's coupon if you do, but we will do our best to answer your questions if you have any. So does anyone have a question? I'm going to take you right there. Yes.
I wanted to know who took care of the blacks and the indigenous?
Who took care of the blacks? My dad did at Burke's. I would say they did a lot. Hattie, when my dad died, she asked if she could come early because she was opening the restaurant. My dad had a relationship with her, and everyone that she was associated with, my dad took care of. Something happened, we don't know what, but he had done her a favor, and she wept and moaned for a good hour. And then she invited my entire family to the restaurant, which she closed down, to honor my dad and have us all there for dinner. So I know that our funeral did a lot for that. That's a good point of not having pictures, and I'm sure in the collection, I just pulled some things from the collection. I'm sure there are pictures of that, but that's a great question. Thank you for asking that. Anyone else? Oh, okay, Mr. Irving has a question.
I want to know when Mark's mustache is coming back.
I know, isn't that great? Yeah, that definitely.
I don't know what you're talking about.
That was a period, wasn't it? I saw a question back here. Yes.
There was a photo of the two women, one in black and one in lavender, half mourning. What does that mean?
Okay, this is a question for Jackie. What does half mourning mean?
So half mourning was can I grab a microphone?
Sure.
So just a little bit about that, and I could talk to you after too. But full mourning was black for a year, and then after that you were allowed to wear other colors that were deemed as appropriate by society. So that was part gray, part lavender, and then with tips of black. Now, I will say that so there were exceptions. So for British history, so with Queen Victoria, when Prince Albert died, she never came out of mourning. And she pretty much expected that the whole country was going to mourn with her. So there were the exceptions, that there were widows that refused to come out of mourning, and they wore black the rest of their lives.
Didn't you say Jackie half mourning was lasted up to 4 years?
Mourning lasted up to 4 years, yes.
So,
For women, not for men.
yes.
So, President Grant, I heard, came up into Saratoga, or at least his body did, and the Holmes funeral parlor was on Woodlawn, and that building still exists at 100 and 110 Woodlawn. I heard rumors that he wasn't embalmed there, but he was left overnight at that funeral parlor and then put back on the train and brought over to Washington. Is that, anybody know anything
No,
about that?
I have to believe that the body was taken by train from Mount McGregor.
Yes.
After Stephen Merritt came up, I don't think the president's body ever came to Saratoga Springs.
I've done a lot of reading on that too. If you go to Fulton History, there's probably 50 articles on it. I have not seen that. So I believe he just went directly from Mount McGregor and then through Saratoga. There's a great article, I'll send you, Bob, where it talks about people lining the streets of Broadway for him to walk or to pass by, and what everyone did for mourning him.
And actually, the Holmes Undertaker office, I think, I'm not sure who mentioned it.
Mr. Israel.
Oh, Bob is here. Okay, Bob, those are your brownstones, right?
Yes.
Okay, but he built those, I think, Ebenezer Holmes. But I think it was for residents. To my knowledge, I don't think, his Undertaker parlor was on
12 Church Street.
12 Church Street. And he lived right around the corner. Glad to see you here. Great.
Anyone? Oh, Susan, you don't need a mic.
I understand that initially in Victorian times, hair was taken of the deceased and sent somewhere to make pieces sorted, funeral wreaths or jewelry, but then the scandal was that they were not using the hair, they were using some other hair, and that's why the Victorian women learned how to do it themselves. The Tang Museum years ago did a funereal jewelry collection, and that's where I heard that, because it was turned out that it was horsehair or it was something.
So I've never actually heard that, and I can do some research on that. But from my research, I've always been aware of the hair that was used from the deceased to create funeral wreaths, to create bracelets, brooches, things that we have on display. I could see how horsehair could have been used, but what I know horsehair and other types of hair were used for were different types of memorial pieces, and they were pieces that actually